three rail trains, usually a term associated with Lionel's O-scale offerings or Merklin's offerings. Originally conceived to overcome wiring issues with early model trains, it offered a clear solution to reversing loops, switches, and rolling stock and locomotive axles. Well, that's what it was usually used for. One company, however, thought a little differently and found a unique use for this third rail. This company was Trix. Trix was created when Stefan Bing left his father's company Bing in the early 1930s when the company began to go bankrupt and began producing metal construction sets. They got started with trains in 1935 when they began marketing an affordable tabletop railway in double O gauge in 1935 under the Trix Express name. Bing was no stranger to making trains, as his father's company had been making trains since the 1880s. Trix Express was not the first double O scale train, as Bing had produced a couple under the name Bing Table Railway back in the 1920s, but it was the first mass market and affordable double O gauge railroad. Stefan Bing is just the first name in our story, so we'll put a pin in that for now and come back to it. Bassett Loke is the second name in our story, and he was a model maker in England and had begun importing trains from Bing and other German manufacturers since 1899. By the end of 1935, Bassett Loke had begun importing Trix Express products under the name Trix Twin Railway. These were repainted to sort of resemble British trains, although they still shared their tooling with German counterparts. Due to rising political tensions, Stefan Bing would flee Germany to England in 1938. Trix had an outlet in England through Trix Limited, and that is what Stefan Bing would join. Bassett Loke and Stefan Bing would continue to be partners, although tension between the two caused a very confusing era where Bing would proclaim that Trix was his system, and Loke would call it designed by Bassett Loke and tried to scrub the Trix name from catalogs and even rolling stock where he could. Production would stop for the Second World War, and Trix Twin would not return to the market until 1948. After World War II, Trix Twin would struggle behind its main rival, Hornby Double O. Hornby had much nicer looking trains and began to use a more realistic looking two-rail system in the 1950s before Trix began in the 1960s. Trix Limited would leave Bassett Loke's control in 1964, but would cease production of trains in 1973. Let's talk about this system in hand. Trix Twin used three-rail trains until the very end, but if it wasn't for wiring simplicity, what was it for? Well, it's in the name, Trix Twin. These tracks have completely isolated rails, unlike Lionel track where the outside two are tethered together. This allows for two circuits to effectively be made on the same track, with the center rail being the common for the system. If you had a catenary setup, however, you could even run a third train if you used the overhead wires. Track geometry is relatively simple. Switches and curves share a radius of 14 inches, with curves getting a half-length piece and straights being standardized sizes of full 7 1/4 inches, as well as a quarter-length section. Some more specialized pieces include the uncoupler, which also had a remotely operated version, magnetic rails, and a diamond. An impulse rail to presumably send power signals to accessories was cataloged, but was never produced. Most of my tracks here say Trix Express Germany on the bottom, so these are either pre-war or they kept using the same molds for a little while after World War II. A couple of my pieces do say Trix Twin made in England, so I assume that these would have been made in the post-war years. Trix Twin track had a base made of Bakelite until 1956, when they would switch to a fiber base without an integrated roadbed. I assume that these rails are steel, as they rust and a magnet is attracted to them. So let's get to talking about the little trains that run on this system. I don't have that many of these as I live in the US, and I just kind of stumbled onto these through dumb luck, but it's a reasonable selection. And we'll start with this one. This is a London Northeastern Railway 520 Series 040. I don't believe that this is even intended to be a model of any particular locomotive. Looking up the road number shows nothing. The locomotive body is entirely die-cast, and the tender is tin plate with only 2 axles instead of the 3 that this truck would suggest. Both the axle and wheel on the tender are plastic. These 520 series locomotives formed the backbone of the entire line, and you could have them in just about every paint job seen on English rails. I also own one in British Rail Black, and an earlier one in London Midland and Scottish Red. The LNER green and LMS red tenders have TTR patents pending and made in England on the rear. The BR Black locomotive does not have this. I guess they rewarded the patent sometime between the manufacturing of these two. I want to talk about this LMS one specifically. This is a pre-war version of this locomotive, and it sports a couple of changes not seen in the post-war version, namely in the front coupler design. It's held in by the buffers on the front, and it's held in by an additional piece rather than a screw. This one has had its original coupler replaced with a post-war one. There is a very slight change to the mechanism here, where the reversing mechanism requires a plate to be removed to take it out. The post-war versions have a plate screwed onto the brush holder instead of the reversing unit itself. The tender has a spring-loaded drawbar, and this was removed in the post-war era. The chassis from the 520 found its way into a good chunk of the Trix twin range, as the 515 tank locomotive I have here uses the exact same chassis. Once again, it's a very dubious locomotive that is not a scale model of a locomotive in really any way. The body is also entirely die-cast, although there would be a later revised plastic body version in the 1960s. It also came in a very wide variety of colors. It also does not say made in England on the rear, and can't find any with the TTR markings there even in the pre-war years. This same chassis would find its way into sets designed to cater to the US market. This is the 524, an American locomotive that is very clearly designed after Pennsylvania Railroad equipment, namely the A5 switcher. Same chassis underneath as the 520, and it also sports a die-cast body. This locomotive comes with a unique all-die-cast slope-back tender with plastic axles and wheels, and is one of very few Trix twin products to include a headlight. You could have this locomotive in any color you wanted, as long as it was black and had no lettering on the tender. There are no made in England markings anywhere on this locomotive. The last unique locomotive I have here is another 520, although an American version. This locomotive uses the same basic body tooling as a switcher, but it has a new smokebox front and pilot. According to the cover of the 1950 catalog, this locomotive is supposed to be inspired by New York Central's iconic Hudsons. This locomotive also has a unique tender, also with plastic axles and wheels, although mine has clearly seen better days. Some of the steps and the rear marker light assemblies have fallen off. Like the switcher, this locomotive also has an operating headlight and was only available in black, with the tender saying Trix Twin on it. This locomotive does not bear any made in England markings as well. Trix made more than just 040s, but if we listed them all, we'd be here for a while. So here's some of the more notable ones. The LMS Princess, the Flying Scotsman. There was a variety of British 440s. There was a pre-war French-inspired 440, an electric four-wheeled locomotive, a train inspired by the Southern's electrification scheme, and the Meteor, a diesel multiple unit set with a working whistle in the locomotive. There's a pretty wide smattering of rolling stock in this line. Most were tin plate with sheet metal frames, but would switch to a die-cast frame for freight cars in the 1950s, and plastic frames by the time that decade was out. I only have two English freight cars here, the operating dump wagon and the brake van. The dump wagon is a pretty simple assembly. It could be unloaded through a magnetic track. I am not actually sure how this works, as I do not have the magnetic track, unfortunately. The brake van has an operating light. It's one bulb for the interior lighting that gets funneled through a red transparent stick for the rear light. Quite a clever design. Both of these cars are equipped with plastic axles and wheels. My other set of freight cars I have here are inspired by American prototypes. They're entirely sheet metal with plastic axles and wheels. There's 6 different designs, with the boxcar, tank car, and caboose being completely unique, and the gondola and flat car sharing body tooling with English counterparts. The Reefer is a repainted version of the boxcar, just with different door printing to mimic the type of door and latches found on Reefers. All of these cars are simply lettered Trix Twin, except for the tank cars, which were labeled for Shell and Union Oil, making them the only American cars to sport real-world markings. The boxcar, reefer, and gondola are all labeled TTR Made in England on the ends. There's a handful of passenger car types, but mostly they can be sorted into 2 main types. There are 6-inch cars, which are all the ones I have here, and they also offered 7-inch scale cars. They all came in a variety of colors, and mine are in LMS red, British Rail cream and red, and I believe these are called LNER teaks. The LMS coaches are pre-war, and some of them have printing on their window plastic, which adds some nice detail. All of these cars have sheet metal frames and tin plate bodies. They come in a couple of different varieties, coach, mail, and I believe these are called brake coaches. Sorry, I'm not an expert on UK stock. They are all stamped TTR Made in England, and the BR ones actually have their patent numbers labeled, while the earlier LMS and LNER ones say patent pending. There's also a trio of American heavyweight style cars in green meant to pair with the American locomotives. They came in baggage, coach, and as an observation car. These cars all come with plastic wheels, and the LMS ones, being pre-war, have metal axles instead of plastic ones. Trix Twin utilized 2 different coupling systems. In the pre-war years, couplers were of a hook and loop design. reminiscent of Märklin equipment. These were prone to getting bent, as bent hooks make coupling borderline impossible. In the post-war years, they switched to this design, which somewhat resemble American knuckle couplers. These can still get bent out of shape, but it is far less likely, and they don't require a spring on the bottom. Pre-war and post-war equipment can still play together thanks to a spike at the top of the post-war coupler that the pre-war loops can grab onto. Track has 3 rails and has 2 pins on the end along with 3 tabs at each end to ensure good electrical connection. It's not the best design as any minor movement tends to separate pieces, but under normal operating conditions it works just fine. Terminal sections have 3 spots to put wires. 2 of these are used per train, with the center rail being the common that will go to the transformer. And before people ask, if you connect a regular DC power supply to the outside rail, a standard 2-rail locomotive can operate on Twix Twin track, assuming that it can take the curves. Trix Twin requires 2 controllers to make full use of the system. These can be both hooked up to the same transformer, or you can use separate transformers. I do have the controllers, but I do not have the proper transformer, as it was a separate piece to the controllers. These trains are intended to be run on 14-volt AC power, and my Märklin transformers seem to do the trick. Locomotives operate with a mechanical reverse unit, which is controlled by interrupting power, much like a Lionel set. Interrupting power causes a shaft with a very specific contact pattern on it to rotate 90 degrees, cycling the locomotive from forward to neutral to reverse, back to neutral once again. This unit is very finicky, but a clean and cared for unit operates reasonably reliably. Locomotives and lighted rolling stock do not pick up through the wheels. They have dedicated pickup shoes. There's 2 in the middle and 2 on the side. The 2 side ones can be rotated 180 degrees with a couple screws to change which outside rail the locomotive will use. If you want to run 2 trains independently, you need to ensure that the locomotive shoes are on different sides. I've set up a small layout on the table here. They did market this as the tabletop railway after all. It operates much like any regular train set. Locomotives are reasonably powerful and trains operate fairly reliably. I was particularly impressed by the speed control here. Most trains of this age have 2 speeds, fast and faster. These aren't able to creep, but they can maintain speed far slower than other trains of the same era. Even though these 040s have short wheelbases, they coast over switches no problem whatsoever thanks to the pickup design. Couplers couple automatically, even when using 2 different coupler types. Let's add a second train to the mix. Even though they share a common rail, it works incredibly well. I still have complete independent control over both of them, and having a second controller allows for these to be operated by 2 different users with no interruptions and no block operating systems. Switches come in 2 different varieties, a hand throw and an electrically operated version. This hand throw is a more modern post-war design, and it's simple enough. It simply has a lever to change it. I do not have the necessary equipment required to activate my electrically operated one, and I don't think it works anymore, unfortunately, but it can still be thrown by hand through simply tapping this assembly here. It's all pretty simple to understand, and it's a very simple system, but it still has a couple of flaws. The most noticeable thing about this system is the voltage drop. All trains experience voltage drop, be it Lionel, Trix Twin, or regular HO equipment, but here it happens incredibly fast. Even this small layout has a noticeable drop around the back section. I've cleaned these rails quite thoroughly, but it still happens. Trix knew this, and they would sell sets of boost rails to give you multiple terminal sections to ensure power gets to all corners of your layout. Speaking of rails, these oxidize extremely quickly. I spent about an hour trying to get these back into an operable state. For a majority of the systems run, they use track with a Bakelite base. Bakelite is like an early version of plastic, but it's very brittle and prone to shattering and cracking upon impact. It's very common to find track sections with pieces missing due to being dropped or mishandled at some point. The lighter train cars really tend to struggle on occasion. Namely, the lighter coaches have issues with reversing on curves, and the 2-axle cars tend to jump up on awkward track joints. I can't imagine this would have been an issue when these sets were new, but at this age, the rails don't fit together quite as well as they once did. The post-war couplers have no centering springs or any method for returning to their default position. This can cause issues during operation, with cars sometimes decoupling. It's not super common and really only happens when it gets bent out of shape, but it is incredibly annoying when it does happen. I also have one big safety concern. These are early 00 locomotives, and the motors for these are actually mounted sideways. It's the only way they could have made them fit, but most steam locomotives in the modern day have a motor mounted lengthwise, whereas these have them sideways, brush holders and all. The motor brush mounts stick out the side of the locomotive, and naturally you'd be tempted to reach down and grab the locomotive by them. These get hot incredibly quickly, and I think most of you could probably see the issue here. I've had friends pick up these locomotives by the brush holders before quickly changing their grip to no longer hold them by the flaming hot bits. If these locomotives are run hard enough for long enough, some locomotive bodies can begin to heat up as well, and I can't imagine some plastic bodies did not melt. Overall, though, when cared for, these little trains provide relatively consistent and smooth operation with a unique gimmick that wouldn't truly be achieved until the advent of digital command control over 50 years later. Ambitions for this range were quite large, with locomotives designed to cater to both North American and French markets. So, what happened? Ultimately, it came down to competition. While Trix Twin was the first on the English double O gauge scene, it soon found competition with Hornby, who created Double O in 1938 to combat Trix Twin. Double O offered more realistic-looking trains for a competitive price. Ultimately, though, both Hornby and Trix Twin would fall to the same opponent. Rovex Plastics created cheap plastic train set in 1950 for Christmas. Rovex would be purchased by the Lines brothers, who would turn the humble cheap train set into a model empire. Steve White compared the prices between the three brands and found that a Trix Twin locomotive would cost around double its Triumph counterpart. Rovex would purchase Hornby in 1964, and Trix would leave the English market in 1973. But we still can't consider Trix Twin a failure. Despite its shortcomings, it still was a sales sensation when it debuted in the mid-1930s. It helped bring about the dominance of smaller scale trains, and Hornby would have likely not have pursued double O gauge until later without them. It's not anything mind-blowing, but it's remained unique through a simple and novel operating system has become a cult classic. In a world of complex and costly DCC systems with computerized switches and locomotives, sometimes it's nice to step back with a very small analog tabletop railroad to just play with two trains. Huge thanks to Steve White, who has put together a comprehensive website about Trix Twin, which has been a massive help in researching this script and for getting this all up and running. I've linked his site in the description. The Trix Twin Collectors Association has also been instrumental, as well as an article in the Brighton Toy and Model Museum. Both are also linked in the description. This video has been well over 4 months in the making, on and off between work, university, obtaining these items, getting the little trains running, writing, editing, losing all my notes to a corrupted file, thoroughly testing these, and then tearing them all down and rebuilding them. I love these little trains, and I love the wacky era they represent. I hope I did these little trains justice.